Elizabeth of the Trinity, Part 2. The Land of Carmel. 3 days after her entrance into Carmel, the prioress sent a photo of the community to the Lyceum Carmel with Elizabeth in the postulant's dress in the front. A note attached said of the new postulant, Sister Elizabeth of the Trinity, who will be a saint, for she already has such a remarkable disposition for it. Seeing her absorbed in prayer at supper that first evening, some of the older sisters thought that she won't last. On entering her cell for the first time with its white walls, simple furnishing, Elizabeth explained, God is here. Her cell was sparsely furnished. It contained a bed with straw and a straw seated chair and a writing desk. The floor was of bare boards. There was no heat or running water, and the only light was from a small lamp, which was oil lamp. Above her bed was a large black wooden cross without the figure of Christ. The Carmelite was to put herself there. She had to die in the world. On the white walls were the three sepia pictures with a small picture on the door that signified the sister's name. It was a simple room, but the very plainness and absence of superficialities gave it a luster and a beauty and a visual peace. Elizabeth described what it meant to her. It is filled with God, and I spent such a wonderful hours alone with my bridegroom. For me, the cell is sacred. It is in this intimate sanctuary just for me and his little bride. We are so much together. I am silent. I listen to him. It is so good to hear everything he has to say. I love him while I ply my needle and work on this dear sage which I have so longed to wear. A happy Carmelite. Elizabeth and Goethe had been accustomed to making their own clothes, so Elizabeth was happy to sew in the quiet of her cell. She was also given the task of sweeping, dusting the choir, arranging flesh flowers for the altar, a task that delighted her because it brought her close to the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. In such an atmosphere, she began to blossom once more, and her health began to improve. She was a happy Carmelite, as Mother Germaine said, and that happiness came through when she described going to the wash for the first time. It is a back-breaking task done by hand with the sisters kneeling round the large tub. For the occasion, I had to put on my nightcap, my brown dress all turned up, a large apron over that, and a complete outfit with wooden shoes. I went down like that to the laundry room where they were scrubbing for all they were worth, and I tried to do like the others. I splashed and soaked and all over, and that did not matter. I was thrilled. So, you can see everything is delightful in Carmel, for we find God at the wash just as in prayer. Everywhere there is only Him. We live Him, we breathe Him, and as you know how happy I am, my horizons grow larger each day. She had entered into an atmosphere of Carmel where God's love was the reason of being there. The life of a Carmelite is a communion with God from morning till night and from night till morning. If we did not fill our cells and cloister, how empty they would be. But we see Him in every circumstance, for we bear Him within us, and our life is an anticipation of heaven. Her intense love of silence often made her the butt of the sisters' teasing, and she was always ready to accept silent challenges from them, which of course she invariably won. Only charity came before silence for her. Interior silence. Elizabeth realized that prayer was not only her response to God, but that interior silence was needed in order to allow God to speak. Her desires, joys, fears, and sorrows, the inner chatter of self, made a continual noise within, and so she easily drowns out the little still voice of God. She wanted to bring a unity into her life that was wholly directed to living in God's presence, obeying Jesus' word, to seek first the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness. Seeking the kingdom of heaven first is like a magnet that draws everything else into its rightful place. She wanted that single eye of for Jesus to speak, which allowed her more and more to see things through His eyes. How necessary is this lovely inner unity to one who wants to live the life of heaven already here below. It drew her into a lovely simplicity. From now on, the Master has complete freedom. He is free to flow out to her, to give Himself without measure. And she is simplified and unified and became the throne of Him who never changes, because unity was the throne of the Holy Trinity. When she had accepted by the Dijon Carmel, she had hope because of her intense love for Jesus that her name would be kept Elizabeth of Jesus. But by the promptings of the Holy Spirit, the prioress saw that her name would be changed to Elizabeth of the Trinity. Disappointed at first because of that, she pondered in her heart the prophetic name, and from then on her life would be entering into mystery of God Himself. On the Feast of the Trinity, she wrote, "Oh, yes, this Feast of the Tree is really my own, for there is none like it. It was really nice in Carmel, for it is a feast of silence and adoration. I've never understood so well this mystery and the whole vocation in my name." Her prayer was to enter into the inner room of which Jesus spoke, and she described that she found heaven on earth. We possess heaven within us, since He who satisfies the hunger of the glorified in the light of the vision gives Himself to us in faith and mystery. It is the same one. It seems to me that I have found my heaven on earth, since God is in heaven and God is in my soul. A continual delight. This continuous sense of God's presence remained with her strongly throughout the period of her postulancy, making prayer a continual delight as well as a need. The community had no difficulty in accepting her for clothing on 8th December 1901, the Feast of Immaculate Conception, where she got the Carmelite brown habit and the white mantle that she longed for. The year would be a testing time for the community, because in July 1901, Mother Mary of the Cross had led a small group of sisters to found the Carmel at Paray-le-Monial, and the Mother Germaine of Jesus was elected Prioress of the Dijon Carmel on 9th of October 1901. In 1902, the secular government of France under Émile Combes had enacted the law of associations even more harshly and closed down schools, convents, and other institutions run by Catholic religious orders, forcing them into exile. Although Dijon Carmel had been assured that they would not be affected, they had to close their chapel to the outside visitors for several months because of the threat of exile still hung over them. Times of doubts and difficulties for Elizabeth herself, as the first year novitiate began, her spiritual life underwent an abrupt change. She lost sense of God's presence and all the joy and ease she had experienced in prayer. Her mind, imagination, feelings created a riot, leaving her in complete confusion and turmoil. Suddenly, the Lord who had been so close seemed to be very far, and she doubted her vocation. Elizabeth could not understand what was happening to her, neither could her prioress nor Father Value had helped her so much in the past. He preached to the community retreat in October and emerged downcast from the parlor after speaking to Elizabeth. Over and over again he repeated, "What would have God done to my Elizabeth? You have changed her, Lord." What was happening to her? Had something gone wrong? There was probably many reasons for the change. Before she entered Carmel, Elizabeth had kept a diary in which she recorded a meticulous details of her spiritual battles against failings, defeats, and successes in keeping herself in the presence of God. While God's grace was undoubtedly working powerfully in her, perhaps it was a great deal of her peace and recollection was due to the strong will surpassing the characteristics of her personality, her temper, her desire for others to give in to her, etc. But God's peace comes from a transformation of all aspects of the personality, bringing harmony without straining or forcing, although always cooperating with the grace of God. Prayer life. Again, Elizabeth needed the trial presented by her loss of joy in the sense of God's presence and the facility in prayer. She had a deeply contemplative spirit, and although she had to struggle with her faults and failings, she lacked real understanding of the difficulties were gifted to God in prayer. She had to learn through hard and bitter experience that prayer is not always easy. This brought her to the deeper humility and realization of how completely her gifts were given to her by God. However, during this difficult period, God was accomplishing a truly positive work in her. He was calling her to a deeper relationship. He was purifying the oversensitivity that Elizabeth had said was her besetting fault, so that she would cling to Him whether she experienced His presence or not. She had to pass beyond the feeling to settle her will only on the will of God. Elizabeth longed to love Him with all her heart, but for this he had to increase her capacity to receive His love. His life is so infinite that it constantly comes up against the limit of human capacity to contain it, and suffering and darkness and the feeling of God's absence is the way in which He queries out those depths in order for the human heart to receive Him. Thanks to the generosity of the Spirit, even though she did not understand what God was doing, she embraced Him in the darkness and was able to work His will in her. She had enough courage to reach out blindly for God in the darkness, even where she could not see, trusting Him to lead her back through safely. Afterwards, she could look back and see how the Lord had been guiding and forming her, and use this deeper wisdom and insight to help others going through a similar experience as this letter shows. It seemed to me that God is asking for abandonment and unlimited trust during the painful times when you feel those terrible voids. Believe that at those times He is hollowing out in your soul's capacities to receive Him, capacities that in a infinite as He Himself is. Try then to will to be wholly joyful under the hand that crucifies you. There were joys for her during this painful time. In the June of that year, Mother Germaine had put her in contact with a newly ordained priest, Henry Beubis, who was going out to China as a missionary. In a letter to him, Elizabeth wrote, "Oh, how powerful over souls is the apostle, who remains always at the spring of living waters. Then he can overflow without his soul ever becoming empty, since he lives in communion with the infinite." This was true for Henry, but it was equally true for Elizabeth herself, the apostolic contemplative. Only by remaining close to the source of grace could either of them be fruitful for souls. On 22nd July 1902, Goethe announced her engagement to George, a doctor who, like Goethe, was an accomplished musician. They were married 3 months later on the feast of Teresa of Avila on 15th October. This began a friendship between Elizabeth and George's brother Andre, a seminarian. St. Teresa of Avila had founded her Carmels with the express intention of praying for priests, and this friendship increased Elizabeth's zeal for intercessory prayer. Teresa had expressively said that if her daughter's prayers and sacrifices are not apostolic, directed towards the salvation of the souls, then they had mistaken their vocation. As she wrote in a letter to Andre, "Staying by this source is like someone who is starving. And this is how I understand the Carmelite apostolate as well as the priest apostolate. They both can radiate God and give Him to souls if they constantly stay close to the divine source." Despite her inner difficulties, in December, the community had no difficulty in accepting her for the profession, which took place on the Epiphany Sunday on 11th of January 1903. Although Elizabeth had crisis of faith on the eve of her profession, after making profession, there was an inner calm and peace return. She was given the post of helping at the turn, that is, with the extern sisters on the outside of the monastery who received visitors, dealt with workmen and other matters while inside the monastery. Elizabeth would deliver messages, bringing sisters to the parlor and deal with supplies and deliveries. She was also made assistant in the office that made the habits for the sisters. She gave her opportunity for precious times of silence in the cell where she could do her stitching. Spiritually, she developed rapidly in union with God, for she loved the times on Sundays and feast day when the Blessed Sacrament would be exposed in the oratory. She spent as much time as her duties allowed in the choir, relishing those times of silent prayer and adoration. Before she entered Carmel, a friend, seeing her absorbed in prayer after Mass, had asked her what she prayed for. And Elizabeth replied very simply, "We just love each other." And this really was the essence of her prayer. She described the simplicity of this to a friend of hers, Francois J. Sordon. "You must build a little cell within your soul as I do. Remember that God is there and enter it from time to time. When you feel nervous or you're unhappy, quickly seek refuge there and tell the Master all about it. Ah, if you got to know Him a little, prayer won't bore you anymore. To me, it seems to be rest and relaxation. We come quite simply to the one we love, stay close to Him like a little child in the arms of its mother, and we let our hearts go." She entered into the Jesus' own prayer. Sometimes Elizabeth did admit to times of dryness, but she was tempted not to give up prayer and leave the choir, for her love and fidelity kept her there. In her prayer of love, Jesus was leading her ever more into a deeper life of prayer. She described what it was to pray. When she went to pray, it was as though entering into Jesus' own prayer, and she was discovering the secret of this from her increasing love of the scriptures, especially Gospel of St. John, and even more from him whom she called her beloved St. Paul. She entered into Jesus' intercessory prayer that continues unceasingly in heaven. Just as Jesus was passed through the veil into heaven, so in her prayer, Elizabeth to pass through the veil, seeing that we bear Him within us and life is an anticipated heaven. It was also the spirit of sonship that enabled her to call out as a child of God with Jesus, Abba. Then it became, as it is always had with Elizabeth, a dialogue of love that entered into that love which is the inner life of the Holy Trinity, where the Father pours out His love on the Son. The Son replies with the whole of His love to the Father. This bond of eternal, unbroken love is the Holy Spirit, the love between the Father and the Son. Before she entered Carmel on holidays beside the sea at Biarritz, Elizabeth loved the power of the sea and also its tranquility, and she drew on this imagery in a letter to the Canon Angels, where she described that love which was almost overwhelming her. "I feel so much love over my soul. It is like an ocean I immerse and lose myself in. It is my vision on earth, while awaiting the face-to-face vision in light. He is in me, I am in Him. I have only to love Him, to let myself be loved." all the time and through all things.